every breath, every thought just felt like complete chaos. It's a state that I don't know how to live like this. I just wanted any sort of peace. And I think that's one of the primary gifts that I've been given in really engaging with God and learning to love him in and through the sorrow, is that peace that surpasses understanding.
Welcome to Mom's Grab Coffee, where you'll be filled with wisdom, faith, and hope through real testimonies from moms of how God works in our lives. I'm your host, Hannah Lapsansky, and I invite you to pull up a chair, grab a cup of coffee, and get ready, my friend. We're about to speak the truth. Hey, what's up, friend? Welcome back to Mom's Grab Coffee. I'm so glad you're tuning in today. Now, this episode is a really powerful, deep one. And I have to add a trigger warning here because it is a mother's story of grief. However, with that comes an amazing transformation from Brianne Edwards. She's the author of a new book called 1,000 Pounds, as well as the founder of Lach's Legacy, which honors her son who passed away. She's going to share her journey of wild faith after she lost her son from SIDS. From believing in the prosperity gospel and thinking that her good works would prevent bad things from happening, to being angry at God and asking the hard questions of why he took her baby from her, to then finally finding a loving God who didn't do that and wasn't asking us to do works in order for him to love us. You're going to be so encouraged in who God is through this really difficult story. During the conversation, we're also going to talk about one of the questions that tends to come up a lot when bad things happen. And that is, if God is so good, why do bad things happen? And lastly, we'll leave it on a really positive note, and that is going through all the ways God showed up in Brianne's book writing and publishing process. And I promise you're going to get chills. It's the kind of things where you can sit back and say nothing, but this is God's hand. All right, friend. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Brianne Edwards and her story. So let's dig into your story here. So I found you through a blog you wrote on Praying Through Ministries. And in it, you said that after the loss of your son, you shared that it took a long time to recover from the wound of just thinking God willed the death of your child. So I wanted to start there. What did that period in your life look like?
Yeah, that was a tough spot. So my relationship, I feel like, with God, I grew up in my faith and I religiously attended church services every weekend, and I went to all of our faith formation classes. It was always a very steady part of my life. And even though, like, in hindsight, I know better, but nonetheless had established kind of a vending machine, sort of a relationship with God, or the prosperity gospel kind of feel, where I felt like if I just did all of the right things, I showed up, I gave enough, time, talent, and treasure, and was doing my best to live the way God wanted me to do, that he would in turn bless me and take care of me. As a young mom with two little boys, the prayer that was deepest in my heart was just for him to take care of my babies, knowing that I can't always protect them from bad things happening. And so, really, I was aiming to earn my way to God's blessing and to earn his good care of my kids. Mm-hmm. And then our son died unexpectedly during a nap at daycare when he was 10 months old. So that was diagnosed as a SIDS death. And in the wake of that, you just hear it echoed in so many places and in so many different ways. People say things like, God needed another angel, or it's all in God's plan, or he's, think he's just in a better place now. Even things like, well, just think of all the good that God will bring from this.
Mm-hmm.
And in those moments, none of that is comforting. And it really put me in a place where I was wrestling with, I didn't know if I wanted a God that would take a baby away from his mother for any of those things.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it put me in a place where there was a lot of self-doubt. Then questions run through your head. If God does this kind of thing, if God plans the death of your child, then is he punishing me for something that I didn't know I was doing? Was I not doing enough? And then also doubting God himself, like maybe he's not as good as I thought he was, or maybe he's not as all powerful as they say he is. So if that was the one thing that I asked of him and my baby still died, like, what does that mean for who God really is?
Mm-hmm. So at that point, did you walk away from God, or were you still trying to find him as good and loving?
I kind of describe it as being in a bit of a crossroads. I think externally, I don't know that anybody would have really seen that I was in that place. I was still showing up for mass. I was still walking through the motions, but inside I was growing a little more distant. There were places still that I could see and feel God's hand in our grief and in the comfort that came from the people around us. But at the same time, I felt very angry and betrayed.
Yeah.
A little like that's I describe it sometimes as the toddler that is mad at you and having a total fit, but they want to throw their tantrum in your lap.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like that was kind of my position with God. I didn't know where else to go, but I wasn't really happy with where we were at either.
Mm-hmm. So on the outward, you looked like you were accepting the words of others who were trying to I guess they were trying to comfort you in a way to say that this is God's plan. So on the outside, were you kind of showing acceptance of their words, but then on the inside, just struggling and kind of getting frustrated that they were saying those things?
It just really created a lot of anxiety around, that's those, the one in particular that stands out was the idea that that God caused Lach's death in order, like, for the good that would come from it, and it seemed too much, and I couldn't make sense of that on the outside. When they say that, I didn't really know what to say in response to that. So I probably gave them a nod and a smile, and then went on to wrestle for weeks and months over what that meant, and if that's true, and if it was true, then what would that mean for my relationship with God, or what part of it isn't true and why?
And at what point did you change your perspective on that?
So it's interesting. So I was in a spot where I was wrestling with the idea of heaven and hell. And the thought that, which I wasn't concerned for my sake per se, because Lach was too young to have sinned. So I knew confidently that he was in heaven and well. But at the same time, considering this idea of heaven and hell, and what would it be like if a mom showed up and found that her child wasn't there? But they say there's no tears in heaven. So I couldn't square those two ideas. Like, I couldn't fathom being a mother showing up expecting to meet your child in eternity and find them not there and not be completely devastated. And so I could never find a great answer that was satisfying my question. And my brother was a seminarian at the time. And so he was home, and I remember just very vividly this moment. We were sitting in my mom's kitchen, and he was standing at the counter making a sandwich. And I questioned to him, thinking, like, you have to have picked up something along the way that can help me, like, make sense of that. Mm-hmm. And he stood there for a really long time, just with his back to me, continuing to make his sandwich. And eventually he answered me with a question, and he said, well, who are you trying to get to heaven for? And my initial response is I was offended and I was mad, and like, clearly you don't get it because you don't have kids. You couldn't like possibly understand what I'm feeling and what I'm going through.
Yeah.
But yet his words like stuck and continued to echo. And it wasn't long after that, I happened to be reading The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. And in this book, it's kind of a funny setup for a book, but you go through various characters that are kind of at the gates of heaven. And there's one character in particular who was a bereaved mom. And as she was showing up at the gates of heaven, she was so obsessive about getting to see her son that she was missing what she needed to do to be ready for eternity. And so it was those two things. Like all of a sudden, I got it, in that if my only goal for heaven was to be able to see my son, I was going to miss the boat, and I may not get there, and I wouldn't get him if I figured out how to fall in love with Christ for his own sake. Then I would get them both. And
Wow. Wow. What a light bulb moment.
yeah, and a hard hitting one too.
Yeah.
Because I wasn't there. My only desire for heaven was because that's where my baby was.
Yeah.
And so to see for the first time that Jesus had to be number one, or I was going to miss something. And so that little shift in perspective and understanding helped me start like, okay, I have to figure out how to love God for his own sake. And what is that going to take? And so it was so much like wrestling with all of the questions that I had, and bringing all of the like messiness and doubts to him. Like I needed his grace and his understanding to be able to even begin figuring out how I could make sense of a world where babies die.
And how did that impact the way you were seeing God before? Because you talked about the prosperity gospel and earning your way to blessing. But this light bulb moment must have really shaken what you truly believed about God.
Yeah, I love that question because that was important too. So before I got to that point, my questions towards God were very accusatory. How could you? How could you do this? How could you do that? After I had that moment, it became questions from a place of humility and like, help me understand. I don't understand how good God can let this happen. Like, show me where is your goodness, and show me where that power is that I thought could save my child.
Right.
And so it was really the switch in approaching God from a place of pride versus a place of humility, and wanting to be taught and wanting to learn what he had to give me.
And what did God show you?
Oh, that's a big question. So much. It's in so many like little bitty questions all along the way. I think from that point, I didn't have any huge, like, life-changing moments. It's been a slow, gradual growth in a relationship with him. It's been subtle new understandings and new shifts in perspective. But it was really like learning to fall in love with God for his own sake really came through making time to sit in prayer on a daily basis, learning to ask the hard questions and not just be satisfied with, we don't know, nobody knows, but to really keep seeking until I found something that stilled that restless peace. And so that's in the wake of the death of my son, like, just peace was the thing that I craved more than anything. Every breath, every thought just felt like complete chaos. It's a state that I don't know how to live like this. I just wanted any sort of peace. And I think that's one of the primary gifts that I've been given in really engaging with God and learning to love him in and through the sorrow is that peace that surpasses understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd love to dig a little bit more into that from a practical sense. So, as a mom, the worst thing that can happen is losing your child, right? And so, when we think about that scenario, the big question is, how do you even recover from that? And so, you mentioned you sought prayer. People like your brother helped you through that. But what are some of the other ways that have kind of brought that peace upon your life after that kind of tragedy?
Oh, the classroom of silence is, it's in that prayer and being able to just slow down and be still for long enough to really see where the movements of your heart are and see what are the things that we're still struggling with. We spend so much time, and it's a normal part of the human condition to escape what's uncomfortable. And it's easier and easier, I think, now with electronics as they are, and have a social media scroll and whatever you want to do. And so it's easy to not want to go there and to not want to lean into that pain or that discomfort, to not really want to understand the nuances of where those pain points are. But it's really only in like taking the time to be still and to see those things and to recognize those things that we can really start to be open to the healing that God has to offer in those places.
I love that. I'd love to go to one of the most popular questions we hear when bad things happen. So, if God is so good, why do bad things happen? So, as a mom who's journeyed through just absolute unbearable tragedy, what are your thoughts on that question that gets circulated a lot?
That's another big hard question. I think one of the important things for me to learn and to start to understand was really the difference between God's perfect will and what he really wants and desires for us versus his permissive will and what he allows for us as the human condition. In all of our sorrow and suffering and death and sickness, those are never things that God wants or desires for us. But being that we are living in the fallen world as we are, they are things that he allows us to experience. So that's, sometimes I think about it as like, God didn't give us the ashes so that he could make something beautiful from them. But when we find ourselves in ashes, we can take those and bring them to him, and he will help us create something beautiful from them.
Oh, that is awesome. I love that. Perfect will versus permissive will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where some of that nuance in it's all in God's plan kind of fits in. And it is in his plan of allowing us to experience the fallen world. But it is not in his desire for us and not in his perfect will for what he originally hoped and created us to be.
Yeah. So in his perfect will for us, he's not bringing tragedy. He's not bringing darkness, because you're right. We do live in a broken world. We do live in a world where the enemy is also trying to attack us and bring us down. But the permissive will, I love seeing the other side of that coin and how those dark things can bring amazing levels of faith and amazing relationship with God as well.
Yeah. In that space, that kind of leads to the next big realization for me, in that it took a long time. I wrestled for a long time, and you start to think you understand, and then you still find that you're still wrestling with, why did God take my baby? And that's, so that's another one that we hear a lot, that God took my baby, God took my child. And this was another one that came in kind of a light bulb sort of moment, and that I understood all at once that God didn't take my baby. He hates death so much. He mourns with us. He weeps with us. Like he wept at Lazarus's tomb with Mary and Martha. Like he is grieving with us and is so grieved by our experiences of losses that's what inspired him to do something to change that for us. And so
yes,
he came,
yes.
he did his work on the cross.
Yeah.
Not in some vague sense, but he did that to give my baby back to me. Like in what he did there, he opened the gates of heaven. He gave me an opportunity to be present with my son for all of eternity. And that wasn't something that was available until he came and did that. So he didn't take my baby. He gave my baby back to me. And as soon as I understood that changed everything. That like in the way, like there was still that little bit of like betrayal and a little bit of feeling kind of angry and bitter that God took my baby. And when that perspective shifted and I saw for the first time that he died on the cross to give my baby back to me, just this overwhelming flood of gratitude and deep love and knowing, like feeling seen and known and loved. And a shift in perspective that changed a lot about my heart towards God.
My gosh, that transformation is so powerful. And just listening to your story, just the way you saw God has shifted in so many forms. Going from more of a prosperity type of God to an angry God to now a really loving God. I love seeing that evolution. How long did it take you to get where you are today in terms of how you see God and your relationship with him?
I would say it's probably been a good 10-year journey. My son died in 2008. And so, it's been 14 years since he died, and it's probably been a good solid 10 of very intentional work and growth in my spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And a lot of beautiful fruit has come out of it. So I want to shift to your book, 1,000 Pounds. So it was just released a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And you mentioned God really showed up in preparing this book, and now it's blessing tons and tons of people who are walking through grief. So can you tell me a little bit more about that writing process?
Sure. So my writing started with our nonprofit. I would write little blog posts on a semi-regular basis. And often I'd hear people say, Brie, you should write a book. And while I love the idea, is the story of the death of a child and how that impacts your life is so big and it's so all encompassing. Mm-hmm. To write a book about that, it was too much. It was, who do you write the story for? And which parts of it do you tell that make sense for a reader? And so it was just this loose abstract idea in my head for a lot of years. And then I have a cousin who has dreams that sometimes mean something. And I was talking to her one day and she said, "Oh, Brie, by the way, I had a dream you were writing your third book." And
you're like, what? I haven't written my first book.
I know, I'm exactly. So that's, I kind of chuckled and I said, "Well, you didn't happen to catch a title and an outline, did you?" And, I was totally joking, but she goes, "Well, no, not exactly. But one of them was called 1,000 Pounds.
Wow. Okay.
As soon as she said the title, which is based on, it's an analogy that I've used for grief for a long time, and that in the beginning, it feels like somebody has dropped 1,000 pounds on your chest. You can't think, you can't breathe, you can't move, you're paralyzed under that weight of grief. But it's not a weight that ever goes away. It's a weight that little by little you learn to carry. Mm-hmm. And so as soon as she told me the title of the book, I sat down later that afternoon and I knew exactly what the book would look like. And I outlined the whole thing. And then as I started writing, I very much felt called to write it in a way that wouldn't be disruptive to the rest of family life. which is not my normal style. If I'm going to do a project, I like to jump in with both feet and get it all done as fast as possible.
Yeah.
But I really just was intentional about being obedient to what I was feeling called to do and how I was feeling called to write it. And so I did. I would write for, 15 minutes or 45 minutes, whatever I could get in the morning before the kids were awake. And so it took me a little over a year to get it all down. But I was probably at a spot where I was 2/3 through writing the manuscript and just starting to look at things like, how do you find a literary agent and how do you pitch a book to a publisher, and anticipating dozens and dozens and dozens of rejections before you get somebody that's interested. And it was about that spot where I had a sudden spur of the moment idea on another book that I would like to co-write. And I sent an email to this guy that I thought would be a great co-author for this book. And he responded, and a few back and forths. And he said, actually, by the way, we're just launching a publishing press and we're looking for authors to partner with. Providential.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing.
So just as I'm walking up to the edge of this big undertaking of finding a publisher, it just fell in my lap.
Oh my gosh.
And
that's
then,
so cool.
Right. And then little things along the way, so the publishing team hired an editor for me to start working with. And there's a part in the book where I talk about dragonflies and how they're important to us after our loss. And they're a symbol of our son for us. And this editor emailed me and she was talking about how dragonflies are important and in her house too. And she said, oh, by the way, the company that I work for is called Dragonfly Editorial.
Oh, wow. I just got chills, Brie.
I know. It's another one of those things that I had no hand in, but it's just God's thumbprint kind of showing up over and over again in this process. There was a long delay in the publishing process as the new press was kind of getting some business pieces underway. And then it turns out that by the time they were ready, they ended up hiring somebody for a different job, even who mentioned she had some publishing background. And she ended up then taking on this book to finalize the last preparations. And she was an amazing gift to this last phase of preparation. And it just so happened to be a book that was meaningful in her life and in her journey at the same time. So just another piece where there's coordination of time and events that is far beyond anything that I could imagine or control. And just those moments, of providence, of God showing up and showing himself through those little things.
Wow. That's so cool. And I can hear your excitement as you're talking about how God has showed up. And I mean, those are things that you just can't make up.
No. So the last piece of this is we planned to launch the book on my son's 15th birthday. And so had it all prepped. But Amazon, in those last preps, they give themselves a pretty wide window as far as how long it'll take from when you submit it to when it will be ready to go out. And it actually ended up being ready about 3 days earlier than we planned. So that's, as we're prepping for this launch and counting down to the day, and then all of a sudden, it's ready.
and go.
Right. I don't know what this is. Well, then in the end, that turned out that then on our son's birthday, a few days later, people all over were opening packages in their mailbox containing the book that is his, essentially, so they were getting gifts of his life and love on his actual birthday.
Beautiful. Oh my gosh. So amazing. So Brie, what are you hoping the reader will take away from your book?
Primarily, in telling my story, I also want it to be a place where people can encounter their own story and really use it as an opportunity to kind of dive into their own grief and wrestle through their own things. So with that, I've created a companion journal that goes with the book to really encourage people to really dive into those kind of tough and sticky places that come with grief. And then just to find companionship. In my early grief, I found so much benefit in hearing other people's stories and the things that they were wrestling with and struggling with, just to know that I wasn't crazy in thinking those things, that other people thought and felt those same things. And so that companionship is an important thing that I hope people can take away from the book. And then really just, their own journey to healing and peace and hope.
What an awesome work you're doing, Bri. And I want to take a few minutes to also talk about your nonprofit in honor of your son. So Lach's Legacy. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and how the mission and how people can support it?
Yeah. So this nonprofit was something that we undertook pretty quickly after Lach died. And that too came from the space of one, resources for bereaved parents. They were so hard to find. There were some infant loss groups that kind of came and went. There was one compassionate friends group that met where we lived at the time, but it was so hard to find resources and others who could walk with me in that journey. And so one of the primary goals was really just to create a hub where people had easy access to finding resources and know where they could start looking, to create a little community of others who had shared similar losses. And so we send out a care package to our focus areas within South Dakota, but care packages to families who have unexpectedly lost an infant. And then some SIDS and safe sleep awareness is another part of our mission. Just helping provide some SIDS awareness and hopefully with promoting some safe sleep and helping parents remember that really is a meaningful way to reduce the risk of those sudden deaths, and in hopes that there will be a few less families that ever have to walk this road. And then lastly, we get to use some of our funds to help support some SIDS related research.
Fantastic. Yeah. Awesome. And your website is lachslegacy.org, LACHS legacy.org. And the book can be found on Amazon. Where else can moms find it?
The book, another good place to go look is there's a website. It's just 1000poundsbook.com. And that's a spot where you can download the journal questions. There's actually a free sample of the first chapter. So you can read the first chapter there. And so, it's a good place to get a real taste of it. It's been amazing, this book, and how many people are really walking away with something from it. People who have not had significant losses are feeling more equipped to accompany the people that they know and love that are grieving. People who have lost parents and siblings are reaching out to me, telling me that they found something in it. So it's just been mind-boggling and beautiful to watch it happen. I feel like at this point, my work is mostly done with it, and now I just get to sit back and watch God do with it as He pleases.
He's already opened so many doors for it to happen, and now, my goodness, I think amazing things are going to happen beyond what you could ever imagine.
It's been a cool thing to participate in, and really I feel like a co-creator with God and with Lachlan on this project.
Oh, amazing. So Bri, I always like to ask moms what they'd like to say to other moms who are struggling. So if you could talk to a mom right now who was struggling through grief, what would you say?
I think one of the first things for me to really grasp was that, as terrible as my grief felt and as lost as I felt in it, that there's nothing wrong with my grief as it was. I wasn't stuck in my grief. I wasn't ignoring my grief. So many people sometimes who love us have concerns about how we're doing our grief work. And it creates a lot of doubts in your own kind of intuitions about what you need. And so really just that encouragement that wherever you're at in this moment, like, it's okay, you're right where you need to be. And we just do the next right thing, one step at a time. And little by little, you kind of walk to a spot where you feel like you're standing on solid ground again. And so with that, this grief is not one that you can dodge or escape or hide from. It will wait, and it will show up in unexpected places. And, if we are trying to dodge that grief, oftentimes we end up with a lot of fear and anxiety about when and how it's going to show up and interrupt our lives, versus if we can really get to a spot where you can lean into that and get comfortable with its presence, then we can live peacefully alongside it.
Thank you for sharing that, Bri. Thanks for you just being so raw and real with us today. That really helps. And just hearing your story, I think, will bring also a level of comfort and reassurance.
Thanks.
Awesome. So yes, the book is 1,000 Pounds, and Bri's nonprofit, lachslegacy.org. I'm going to have all those links in the show notes, so everyone go check it out. But thank you so much, Bri. I really appreciate you sharing your heart today.
Thanks, Hannah. This was a fun conversation.
All right, friend, I hope you enjoyed that episode and all that wisdom and hope from Brianne Edwards. If you'd like to check out 1,000 Pounds, you can go to Amazon. You can also go to 1000poundsbook.com, where you can also get a free journal with a book purchase. Also, please check out lachslegacy.org to go support families who are walking through SIDS and child loss. I'll have all the links to both 1,000 Pounds as well as the nonprofit in the show notes. Or you can go to momsgrabcoffee.com/27. And lastly, remember, I still have those faith-based phone background designs available for you. There are 6 designs, and they're going to encourage you to trust God and have faith, to be strong every time you look at your phone. So go get yours. They are available at phone.momsgrabcoffee.com. That's phone.momsgrabcoffee.com. Alrighty, my lovely friend, thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you have an amazing week, and I'll catch you again next time for a cup of coffee with a side of faith, wisdom, and hope.